Volume 1 Chapter 10.2. Trapped in the living hell. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. After Klopp saved his life, that was what Aylock said as soon as he opened his eyes. Klopp had forgotten that some pathetic pigs were only interested in pounding and being pounded. And the fact that Aylock was one of them. Even after all he'd been through, Aylock never stopped showing interest in Klopp. Aylock was really the same aristocrat as before. It now made Klopp feel that this situation was ridiculous. No matter how much pain he had caused him so far, if it was sexual, he would eventually get turned on and exhale hot breath. It was the only time he would shed his pretentious shell and reveal his true self. Destroying his high and mighty arrogance was surprisingly easy. Chuckling, Klopp climbed onto the bed. It was his first time having sex with him, without intentionally wanting to inflict pain on him or when he wasn't in heat. He hugged Aylock's thin body, relaxing his grip and trying not to let his temper get the better of him as he would suffocate. He touched him slightly, his body scent was fading with his vitality dropping. He brushed his lips against Aylock's body. To make the dying fire burn a little more. Aylock seemed very inexperienced. He acted like an innocent virgin who didn't know anything about caressing. He had lived on the streets for years and had already given birth to 4 children, and yet when Klopp licked and sucked on the sensitive places, Aylock's face twisted and he covered his mouth with his hand. His blue eyes, which looked very startled, looked at Klopp. He raised the corners of his mouth and acted even more repulsively. He licked and touched his entire body, kissed him, and eventually had a deep kiss with him. He couldn't remember ever kissing Aylock before. Aylock didn't know what to do with the tongue inside his mouth. Seeing him pretending not to know how to breathe, Klopp thought he was being hilarious. He broke the sloppy kiss and whispered softly while licking his hot ear. "Don't pretend to be innocent when you're just a worn-out whore. It's disgusting." The blank gaze that had been facing him turned away. Judging from the way he trembled, it seemed he was weak against such things. But was it something he disliked, or was it something he enjoyed? Klopp didn't hesitate to lick all over Aylock. He had thought it was dirty, but once he made up his mind, it wasn't difficult to do. When he sucked on Aylock's penis, Aylock twisted his body in pleasure. His breathing became ragged, unable to bear it. "Chloe, pp. Ah, stop." Arching his back and pushing Klopp's head away with his hands and shaking his thin body, Aylock soon reached his climax, his skinny thighs wrapped around the man's head. Aylock ejaculated in his mouth and Klopp swallowed half of it, before kissing Aylock to give him a taste of his own semen. When the bitter taste entered his mouth, Aylock frowned, but he didn't break the kiss. Instead, he grabbed the shoulder part of Klopp's shirt with his bony and thorn-like fingers. His fingers dug into the dampness of Omega's body. Following Klopp's lead, Aylock bent over and raised his butts, clawing at the old pillow and shuddering. Spreading his butts open, Klopp licked the unsightly wrinkles with his tongue over and over. The wrinkles could hardly be called pretty. As soon as the licking began, Aylock's throat rumbled as if he were about to cry. Klopp silently said, "Just a little more," but there were no tears from Aylock that seeped into the pillow. He clicked on his tongue and inserted his fully hard penis into the moist, loose folds. "Ah, a voice, not too high and not too low, came out. His arousal grew and blood rushed to his lower body. He wanted to lose his control and pound into him, but he forced himself to hold back, afraid that Aylock's bony and thin butts would break. Instead, he slowly and gently pushed in, gradually increasing his pace. Aylock, who was moaning with his face buried in the pillow, soon started screaming uncontrollably. His weak cries were as feeble as a bird flopping around after being shot by an arrow. As Klopp slowly reached his climax, he came deep inside, and simultaneously, Aylock also came for the second time. He seemed to have used up all his energy. He turned his limp body away to embrace Klopp and kissed him deeply. With a dazed expression, he smiled faintly looking at Klopp. "This isn't like your usual self. Why are you suddenly like this?" The wavering eyes seemed to expect something from him, so Klopp smiled and whispered in a soft voice. I hate you so much. I'm disgusted with you. I hope you meet the same miserable end just like what you did before. As he saw Alok's pupils dilate in shock and horror, a sense of immense satisfaction rose in Klopp. He kissed Alok's dry cheeks and chuckled softly. He had been busy with an important appointment for a while. After several days since he had last seen Alok, Klopp was finally able to walk alone through the rose garden. The path to the cabin was now so familiar that he could find it even with his eyes closed. After that first time of having intercourse that's more like sex than rape, Alok's facial expression changed. He didn't stop his faint smile completely, but whenever their intercourse started, he would grimace and cling to Klopp as if he would cry. Sometimes it was very arousing to pick his cruel words to whisper to Alok. Every time, Klopp would unknowingly hug the Omega who was clinging to him and run his hands down his back and legs. Alok now even aroused his protective instincts. As he wrapped the Omega's trembling and thin body, Klopp frequently chuckled. Even today, Klopp felt a little happy at the thought of seeing Alok's pitiful appearance, who was like a rain-soaked bird. Alok was currently pregnant. It was already his 5th time. His body was weak, so he seemed to be on the verge of miscarriage a few times. Alok never told him about those incidents, so Klopp could only guess. After he gave birth this time, Klopp planned to bring Alok to the estate during the winter. His body temperature kept dropping. Klopp didn't want for him to just freeze to his death in the cabin. After childbirth, he was likely to be extremely weak, so it seemed better to spend quite some time next to his side. The hard wooden bed in the cabin was uncomfortable, and since they would sleep together anyway, it would be better for Alok to stay in his bedroom. Or should I bring Alok to the estate before he gives birth? If the child came out early, alone in the cabin, he might get into a dangerous situation. The corners of his mouth twitched upward as he imagined how Alok would be surprised to hear this. His steps quickened slightly. However, all that joy evaporated when he entered the dimmed cabin. Alok. Alok. As soon as Klopp learned that Alok had disappeared, he was filled with extreme rage. To think that he's running away now. What a weak guy. It was not acceptable for Alok to secretly escape from the hell they had created together. Klopp returned to the estate, shouting loudly and immediately dismissing his servants to search for Alok. No one answered Klopp's question about when he escaped. Even the gatekeeper, Hagen, didn't know about it, so Alok had definitely fled during the night. This was the first time he had escaped. It was always Klopp who had thrown him away, but Alok had never run away on his own. When he was brought to the cabin for the second time, he lived as if nothing had happened. So Klopp didn't think that it was possible for Alok to escape. Alok always returned to the estate on his own. He returned on his own when Klopp found him wandering at the bottom of his life, so he never suspected this would happen. Moreover, there was no lock on the cabin. After all these years, there was no reason for him to run away in his weakened body. He was even so close to giving birth. I should have kept him locked up. I should have broken those thin ankles and chained them with a metal chain, not letting him out of the small wooden cabin, so that even if he hid his body in the darkness, I could just pull on the chain to make him come running to me. Klopp regretted it too late. It took him a full day to finally find him at the deep bottom of the town. When Hagen, who had found his tracks first, came running to the pale Klopp, who was searching in another direction, his feelings were much more miserable than what he had felt before. The news that someone with his child was found on the deep bottom once was enough. He swore that once was enough to send him into an agony that would never heal. But why did he have to hear such news twice? Why? Why on earth? Despite his brain that struggled to think properly, his body moved very fast. Not long after, he discovered a heavily pregnant Omega surrounded by several alpha men, being raped in a back alley near a filthy brothel. Wow, I never knew a guy with a baby could be so arousing. Do you know how long I've been looking for you since you disappeared a few years ago? Today, we'll treat you well and feed you lots of raisin bread. Where did you get the baby? I thought he was an alpha. You've fooled us all this time. What does it matter? As long as his hold is tight. It's even better if he's an omega who could give birth, but even if he's an alpha, it doesn't matter. He's bleeding. He's not dead, right? Hey. You're not dead, are you? Amidst the laughter of the men, the sound of flesh colliding echoed. The smell of blood mixed with an unpleasant fishy odor. The men shifted the unresponsive limp legs. In between their grotesque movements, he could see a bloated stomach, a twisted arm that seemed to be pulled around, a neck and face covered in bruises, a gaping mouth, and lifeless blue eyes. When the limp neck moved with the men's movements, the dead eyes made eye contact with Klopp, and soon, darkness suddenly engulfed him. When he regained his senses, a decapitated corpse was lying in two separate parts, and a bloody sword was in his hand. Ah! It's murder. The other two, who still couldn't hide their hideous penises, ran away in a panic. Klopp fixed his gaze downward and commanded grimly. Kill them all. Yes, master. Hagen and another servant who had come with him pulled out their swords and chased after them. The ones who couldn't even pull up their pants and run properly, turned into an alley, and soon met their end with an unpleasant sound of necks being cut. However, that didn't matter to Klopp. He pushed aside a decapitated corpse. Covered in blood, Alok was much worse than he had expected. His bare lower body was covered in bruises and dirt. One end of his splayed leg was broken, and his ankle was stretched outward. The worst part was between his legs. Unable to withstand the brutality of those beasts, it was ripped apart and was bleeding a dark color, almost black. Along with that, there were traces of semen stuck to him. Klopp put down his sword and shakily took off his coat. Then he knelt beside Alok, who was shivering and as pale as a corpse, unlike his lower body full of red. Then, Klopp embraced his body. As he wrapped Alok in his coat, the unconscious body swayed left and right like a broken doll. Carefully lifting his grotesquely disembodied arm and placing it on his chest, Klopp called out with a trembling voice. Alok. Despite wanting to scream and shake him awake immediately, Klopp couldn't make any big noise at all. If he did, he felt like Alok would shatter into pieces. He couldn't even touch the bruised face with his hand. It was hard for him to breathe too. Alok. Wake up. At some point, his throat had closed up. As he tried to figure out what he could do to get anything from the unresponsive man, the tightly closed eyelids fluttered a little. He quickly brought his ear to Alok's nose and heard a faint, rasping choked breath. Thank you. Really. Thank you so much. Klopp didn't even know who he was thanking. He just repeated it several times. The two men he had sent away returned with blood on them. Seeing them, Klopp gestured to the other corpse. Hagen nodded wordlessly. The other servant ran out of the alley and fetched the carriage. Klopp lifted the limp Alok in his arms. Even though he was thin, being a full-term pregnant omega made him quite heavy, but Klopp didn't want to use anyone else's help. He didn't want anyone to touch even a single strand of his hair. As he held him, Alok grimaced and made a weak sound, either because of his broken arm and leg that hurt, or the other parts of his mangled body. Klopp put his head against his wet forehead and said, It's okay now. I won't let you and our child die this time. Volume 1 Chapter 10.3 Trapped in the Living Hell. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. They returned to the estate and Klopp laid Alok on his bed. His water had broken during the ride, so Klopp's clothes also became a mess. It wasn't time for the baby to be born yet, but it seemed to happen because of the sexual violence by those several men. He resented the fact that he couldn't kill those bastards more painfully. Martha. Help me. You, call the doctor. After ordering one of the maids, Klopp turned towards Alok. His face, which had been groaning all the way from the carriage, was now so pale as if he would die at any moment. Martha had come running and was shocked at the sight of how filthy Aylock had become. She stood still for a moment before running outside. "Bring warm water and towels now. And new sheets and nightwear too. Everything." After yelling at another maid, she pushed Clop away from Aylock's side. "Stay over there for now. Holding his hand won't be of any use now. Martha. We need to save him, don't we? Then please cooperate, so I can do my job." Clop was pushed away from the bed, and until the doctor arrived, she tended to Aylock's wounds. Seeing Clop's messy clothes and realizing that Aylock's water had broken, the experienced housekeeper patted Aylock's cheek to wake him up. "You can't lose your consciousness. Wake up. Here. Bring more towels." At her resolute command, the other maids took the towels soaked with blood away and gave her new ones. Meanwhile, another maid approached Clop and asked him to change his clothes, but he refused. He would not leave the room until he confirmed that Aylock was safe. The doctor arrived shortly thereafter and entered the room, horrified that a full-term Omega had been sexually abused by several men. "When did the water break?" "Not that long ago." "Oh no, this is a very big problem. It's going to be tough." At Martha's words, the doctor looked up from the white sheet covering Aylock's lower body and he clicked his tongue. "The bleeding is not stopping. If we don't take the baby out quickly, both of them will be in danger." The doctor rolled up his sleeves and looked at Clop before asking, "Are you the alpha?" Before the serious-looking doctor could say anything more, Clop spoke up first. "Save them both. I can't guarantee that. As you can see, the baby is premature, and too much blood has already been lost. If you can't save them, I won't just stand by. There's no point in threatening me. I may be a doctor, but I'm not God. But I'll do my best." Ignoring the angry Clop, the doctor quickly went back to Aylock's side and gave commands to Martha. Following his commands, Martha prepared clean scissors, silk thread, and warm towels. In the meantime, there was nothing that Clop could do. It was the same as before. All he could do was wait. The doctor worked on Aylock with quick hands. "Since the birthing Omega has lost consciousness, we have no choice but to push the baby out forcibly. Don't just stand there, come here and help hold him down." Clop obediently followed his instructions. The doctor folded the towel a little and put it over Aylock. He then asked Aylock to tightly grab Aylock's already sagging shoulders. "It's no use if you press them so loosely. Press tightly. His shoulders are dislocated. It's nothing compared to the pain he's about to experience. Just hold on tight because I'm going to pull hard." "What are you trying to do?" "We first have to take out the baby first, before I can save him or not." With that, the doctor deeply lowered his body as if he was going to climb onto the bed. Then, he placed both hands on the bloated upper belly of the pregnant Omega, before giving signals to Clop who was pressing Aylock's shoulder, and Martha who was waiting between his legs. "Let's begin." He pressed his full weight down on Aylock's belly. At that moment, Aylock, who had been lying unconscious, opened his eyes wide and his whole body tensed. Even Clop was surprised at how hard he was trying to stand up and had to press his shoulders down. Aylock. Despite the towel in his mouth, a terrible scream erupted in a delayed response. Clop, white-faced and shaking, embraced Aylock's broken and thrashing body, his eyes wide and flipping over. "Are you really doing it right? He's dying right now. He's not in the position to push the baby properly, so I have to push the baby out with force. Hold on tight. If you back off here, both the baby and this person will die." The doctor gave him a brutally cold response and continued to press down on the belly. From the top, to the middle, then bottom. It was hard to tell as Aylock was covered by the sheets, but seeing Martha's face turning pale, the situation must not be doing good. The maid who continued to hand Martha clean towels from the side looked like she could pass out at any moment. "Doctor, I can see the head." "Really? Keep pushing, and when the head comes out, grab and pull the baby out. Do you understand?" "Yes." While a few more thrashings followed, sweat broke out on Klopp's forehead. Amidst the piercing screams, no one said anything. A moment later, after using so many towels, Martha looked at the doctor and slipped her hands under the sheets, and she pulled out a very small baby. At the same time, the doctor released the two hands that had been pressing down on the belly. Alok's thrashing also stopped. He gradually relaxed and stretched his body out. Klopp breathed heavily while holding him. He didn't even think about looking at the baby, thinking that it was finally over. The doctor cut the small umbilical cord of the premature baby and left a belly button before handing the baby over to Martha. She wiped away the tears that had formed in her eyes as she let out a relieved sigh. She tried to give the baby to Klopp, but he shook his head. "Quickly, save this person first." Alok's breathing was very weak in Klopp's arms. "It's not too late yet. If we stitch up the wounds and stop the bleeding, he'll live." The doctor immediately took out a needle and thread from his medical bag, sterilizing them in boiling water. Then he pulled the soaked sheets away and was about to sew up the torn wound when he blinked a few times and put down the forceps he had picked up with a deep sigh. He then began to feel around inside with his hand. At that moment, Alok opened his eyes halfway again and began to make a whimpering sound, as if he didn't have the strength to scream anymore. His indescribable anguished face was neither crying nor laughing. Alok struggled, tearing at Klopp's arm, which was holding him down, and writhed in agony. The sound of his terrifying cry sent a chill down Klopp's spine. "What's going on?" "Oh no, the babies are twins. This way, we won't be able to stop the bleeding." The doctor looked at Klopp with a stern face, then shook his head. Klopp's mind went blank, and he didn't know what to say. While he was speechless, Alok let out another horrific scream. The second baby was starting to come out. Finally, the other baby came out. The second baby was much smaller than the first, so the doctor had to perform artificial resuscitation to help the baby breathe. Eventually, the baby survived, but Klopp didn't have time to hold the frail creature. Alok was dying. His body is too weak, and he has suffered severe mental and physical trauma. Even if he hadn't gone through that incident, an Omega male would still get into this condition, as you've impregnated him 5 times. That's why I advised you to use birth control in the first place. Clicking his tongue, the doctor shook his head and added, "I'll do everything I can, but honestly, it's hopeless. If he survives, it'll be a miracle. It's better for you to be prepared." Klopp said nothing. Martha and the other servants were distracted because of the sudden delivery of the babies. Having nothing else to do, the doctor left, leaving Klopp alone with Alok in the now silent room. In Klopp's arms, Alok was already like a corpse. It was doubtful if he was even breathing. Klopp held his limp hand, placed it on his chest, and stroked his forehead with his other hand. At that moment, Alok's eyelids trembled slightly, then he let out a small breath. "Alok." When Klopp called his name, Alok slowly opened his eyes. His eyes, which were staring blankly at the air, gradually narrowed their pupils and titled his head toward Klopp. He blinked very slowly, his full lips barely moving. Alok's voice was weak, almost inaudible if Klopp didn't listen closely. "The baby. They're twins. They both survived. Good. Thank goodness." The voice was as light as air, devoid of any life, and Klopp struggled to suppress the overwhelming emotion that he felt. Otherwise, everything inexplicable would burst out all at once. Klopp chewed on his lip and stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to catch his breath. He barely contained himself because he didn't know how to feel at the fact that Alok woke up and looked for his child first even after experiencing such a horrible thing. Alok had enough consciousness to realize that he was giving birth even when the onlookers were going crazy in the situation. You're just really. He swallowed the emotions that kept rising. He had to make him say something. Otherwise, he felt like he would die too. Why did you run away? None of this would have happened if you hadn't run away. He didn't intend to, but his criticism still poured out. Alok slowly closed his eyes, then opened them again and spoke up. It hurt. Those people weren't human. That was not sex. You idiot. You were raped by multiple people. That was a rape. Klopp couldn't listen to Alok anymore and his anger flared. Alok's eyes blinked again. I can't feel my body. From how he had been talking nonsense from earlier, it seemed like Alok was drifting in and out of consciousness. It was a miraculous situation that he was even able to speak. No matter how angry or accusatory Klopp got, it was useless. You've lost too much blood. Alok looked at Klopp with slightly trembling eyes, then cast his gaze into the distance and said. Am I dying? Probably. Ah. Alok blinked again. Even though he had been told that his death was imminent, he didn't show any sign of movement, or emotion or shed any tears. He closed and opened his eyes for a moment as if he was listening to someone else's story. He looked at Klopp and gave a faint smile. Is this how Raphael died too? Did he still have the strength to be sarcastic even at this moment? Klopp felt like he couldn't breathe due to overwhelming despair and frustration. He wondered when would this demon finally be satisfied with torturing his soul. What crime had he committed for Alok to pick and choose only the cruelest things to do to him? He really wanted to go mad. Perhaps it would be better to go mad and forget about these indescribable emotions. The emotions that he had been holding back were starting to pour out. Volume 1 Chapter 10.4 Trapped in the Living Hell. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. What did I do wrong to you in the first place? Why are you doing this to me? Tears of despair flowed from the eyes of the broken man. Even as he was dying, this damned demon had hurt him more than he could bear. Yet he couldn't even curse him. He could only hold the dying body and shed tears uncontrollably. Cold tears fell on his fair cheeks and rolled down. Alok's eyes shook as he saw him. His wounded lips trembled slightly. I'm sorry. After all these times, don't tell me such a lie. I'm sorry. For everything. I now understand the pain that Raphael must have felt. I was just trying to die quietly. And for making you recall your wounds again, shut your mouth. Klopp screamed at the top of his lungs, feeling like he was about to go insane. He reached out to strangle the demon, eager to end his life as quickly as possible in a moment of intense hatred. However, as his hands clenched around its slender neck, he froze up. The glassy blue eyes, that always confronted people, were full of tears. Ah! As Klopp's grip loosened, clear teardrops rolled down his golden eyelashes, wetting them. At first, I thought I would have to take the suffering. Because that's how I should pay for my sins. I just have to stay still, like before. But I couldn't do that when my child was getting in danger. So I rebelled, and got beaten. It wasn't just a simple beating that he had suffered. His arm was dislocated, his ankle was broken, and his entire body was abused. And yet, without a single curse, Alok's narrative was stoic. It was as if he didn't even realize that he was crying. Raphael would probably have done the same. Because he wanted to protect the child. Because it was his child with his beloved person. Klopp wanted to say how dare he say such words, but he couldn't say anything because his throat was too tight to speak. Alok smiled as he looked at him. Tears streamed down endlessly. He had lost so much blood, Klopp couldn't understand from where did those tears come. It was like the dam that had been clogged finally collapsed and everything he had gathered in his life was pouring out. My eyes feel strangely hot. Ah, I'm now, crying, aren't I? The corner of Alok's mouth slightly curled up, as if he were pleased. His drooping fingers were struggling to move as if he wanted to feel his tears, so Klopp wiped away his tears with his thumb instead. Looking at his soaking wet and large hand, Alok closed his mouth and swallowed, feeling choked up. Will you believe me now? I have feelings too, and I can get hurt. Even though I committed an unforgivable sin that cannot be washed away. After a moment of trembling voice, Klopp nodded his head. His wet blue eyes grew a little bigger and then softened. I was going to ask forgiveness from you and Raphael, but now that I have experienced it, it's not something that I can ask for forgiveness. He will be in heaven and I won't, so I probably won't even be able to meet him. He smiled and blinked his eyes. Tears that had been welling up in his eyes fell down. Turning his head away from Alok's view, Klopp sobbed under his breath. Tears flowed down his cheeks and chin, not really knowing what those tears meant to him. The tears that rolled down his cheeks and chin got mixed with the tears running down Alok's white face. Alok, as usual, didn't avoid his gaze and spoke with a faint smile. I apologize for all the trouble I've caused you. Someday, I hope to be reborn and repay you. And at that time, I won't go anywhere near your lover. Is that all you have to say to me? Klopp could only respond with a hollow laugh to Alok's aristocratic sarcasm in even his last words. You cruel demon. Klopp took Alok's hands with both of his and pressed his forehead against them. He didn't know what to say. Goodbye. Leaving him in this wretched world and continuing to live a cursed life forever. This damned bastard. Then he heard a fading voice. I love you, BDNV. At first, he thought he misheard it, and Klopp raised his head and stupidly asked, what? Alok smiled and repeated himself. I've always loved you. Klopp didn't know what to say. With a blank expression, he denied him, what you did wasn't love. Alok looked a bit dejected at his words and then awkwardly smiled. Maybe. I've never been in love with anyone else, but you, so I might not know what love really is. With those words, Alok let out a deep sigh. Unlike before, he barely managed to continue speaking without breaks. Still, even if it's a lie, it's okay, won't you, just tell me once, that you love me. But Klopp couldn't bring himself to say such words. It was okay even if it was a lie, those common words were nothing to him, but still, he couldn't just say it. Alok didn't say anything more, leaving behind a bitter smile. The blue eyes met the flickering dark brown eyes for a moment, unmoving, before they slowly disappeared into his eyelids. Alok. At the urgent call, the eyelids that were just fluttering open slightly, dropped back down and closed completely. No matter how much Klopp shook and called out, Alok didn't open his eyes again. He didn't die immediately. That quack of a doctor had barely managed to stop the bleeding, and in that state of unconsciousness, Alok managed to hold on for 3 days. He slept in Klopp's arms in a clean and tidy bed, and on the 3rd day, he quietly took his last breath on a sunny morning. In those 3 days, Klopp didn't understand why he held his despised enemy in his arms and kissed him on the forehead until the very last breath. He just couldn't bring himself to leave the slowly cooling body alone. Klopp never took a step out of the room until the weak breath had completely stopped. Sometimes, he would give a little water to the pale, unconscious Omega's lips. Their parched and chapped lips touched, and a faint breath escaped. As Alok drifted into an everlasting sleep, he occasionally moved his lips and shed tears, dreaming of something. Then, Klopp would hold him close and brush his lips over the corner of his eye. Strangely enough, it turned out that tears had a flavor. It should just be salt water, but it had a very deceptive and indescribable taste. It wasn't bitter or salty, but rather a sweet taste that made his tongue numb. He wondered if he had finally gone insane. But he soon realized it. Alok was having one of his last very happy dreams, and that's why his happiness overflowed and his tears tasted sweet. To anyone else, they would be mere salt water, but to Klopp, who had been wrapped in Alok's scent for years until their scents mingled together, the tears tasted like drugs as he licked them while holding the cold body and gently stroking his back. The weak body gradually stiffened. Occasionally, while holding Alok's hands and kissing his forehead, Clop would call out Alok. But Alok never woke up from his happy dream. When his heart, which had been beating slowly, finally stopped, Clop drank the last tear that Alok shed and gave him a short kiss on his dry lips. Wrapped in white sheets, Alok looked incredibly peaceful, as if he was drifting towards his dreams. Now, there was no one left in this living hell but himself. He couldn't afford to take his own life like Alok did. Because there were their children. Their gem-like children who came to life because Clop raped Alok and made him sacrifice what was left in his life. In return, Clop was left with a torn soul that would never heal and forced to live alone in this terrifying hell forever. From now on, he would eternally be alone. Unlike Raphael, who was buried in the family cemetery, Alok was buried in a sunny spot near the cabin. His tombstone was simple, with only his name and the years of his birth and death. There were no epitaphs inscribed on it. He didn't bring any flowers to the tombstone, but instead, the colorful and beautiful flowers that he had tended so diligently in his lifetime bloomed vividly and decorated the lonely tombstone. Until the end, he was a shining light unto himself. Sometimes, when he took their growing children near the cabin, Clop would stand in front of the tombstone for a long time. His regrets overcame him late. He should have told him what he wanted to hear then, even if it was a lie. As he ran his fingers over the tombstone, he tried to say those words belatedly, but he couldn't bring himself to say them in the end. After a while, Clop turned towards the children, calling out to him in the distance. And that marks the final chapter of Volume 1. There will still be a short epilogue to this volume and a preview to the next volume before we move on to Volume 2. From now on, I will be updating the chapters separately every 3.4 days, 3rd/6th/9th. Please look forward to the continuation of the story. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 1 Chapter Scene Number 1. Once upon a dream. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He saw a beautiful rose garden blossoming into colorful flowers. Alok, from the T-Wind family, strolled leisurely through the green space, bathed in early summer sunshine. Recently, he received several proposals from various households. It was his duty as the successor to his family to choose a suitable Omega and get married, and Alok thought that was expected of him. He planned to evaluate the Omegas carefully, just like selecting roses. They shouldn't be too ignorant, but it would also be troublesome if they were too smart. It was fine if they had a certain level of wealth, but it wasn't necessary for them to be excessively rich. They should be cultured and well-behaved. Preferably, a female Omega. Male Omegas often couldn't give birth to many children and had a high risk of dying during childbirth. His own mother was a male Omega, and giving birth to him had compromised his health. Although a single child could monopolize their parents' attention, Alok believed that having more children was better. If he chose a female Omega, she could give birth to numerous energetic children and fill this spacious garden with life. That's how Alok dreamed. If he hadn't encountered a lost young man from the countryside in the garden that day. Tall and handsome, he had none of the sophistication of city aristocracy. Instead, he possessed an upright, innocent, and kind smile that anyone could recognize at a glance. Being invited to the Count's tea party, the guy had wandered a bit in the garden and lost his way. Alok kindly led him to the rose garden where the party was being held. I am Alok T-Wind. And you? Clop Bandyke. In front of the rose garden, Clop showed a faint smile as he looked at Alok. At that moment, Alok experienced a cliché feeling that could only be expressed as a fluttering of the heart. As they shook hands, Alok stared into Clop's dark brown eyes. And his serious pupils were directed at him. Alok saw himself reflected in those eyes. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, gazing at the other person absent-mindedly. He looked like a young boy falling in love. So he smiled, not with a subtle fragrance-like smile, but brightly and vividly, like a rosebud bursting open with all its might in the early summer. A rose was most beautiful right before it fully bloomed. Once a bud burst open, it would soon wither and lose its vibrancy when getting hit by rain. When he returned to the estate, risking his life, and had their second child, there was a woman who approached Klopp. Although her appearance was different from his wife's, her manner of speaking and her personality were remarkably similar to Raphael, who had passed away. She had a kind and gentle nature. Klopp seemed to like her, and he occasionally invited her to his house to have tea. She seemed to already know that Klopp had one child, but it didn't seem to bother her, and they became very intimate. One day in the estate's garden, Klopp kissed her hand and gently smiled at her. She became shy, but they shared a kiss on the mouth. Aylock observed them from a window in the estate, feeling as if the late Raphael had come back to life and was mocking him. A fiery jealousy rose within Aylock. As the father of their child, he couldn't tolerate seeing Klopp involved with another Omega. However, he couldn't order someone to get rid of her as he had done before. He didn't have that power anymore, and more importantly, he didn't want to resort to such methods anymore. Instead, Aylock made an effort himself. He pretended to be sick or in distress to keep Klopp by his side, even for just a little while, and prevented him from meeting her. The baby isn't moving. Once the lie started, it couldn't be stopped. Using the excuse of the baby, Klopp would spend the whole day by Aylock's side, placing his hand on Aylock's belly to check if the baby was moving or not. Although the baby moved quickly inside the womb, Aylock held on to Klopp's hand and didn't let go. He knew the woman was waiting outside for Klopp, but he purposefully didn't let go of him until the end. It hurts. I might have a miscarriage. Let's call a doctor. The baby needs a father. With a faint smile, Aylock made such demands. After Klopp embraced the dying Aylock back to the house, Klopp distanced himself even more. He still had his piercing gaze, but no Alpha could resist looking at the Omega who bore his child. Aylock was confident in that. Eventually, Klopp sighed tiredly and called a maid to inform the woman that she should return. It was a highly offensive act. He didn't apologize directly to her, instead, he conveyed it through a maid. However, Aylock made him do that. It was also Klopp's fault for hiding Aylock's pregnancy. Even if it would become a little troublesome, if Klopp had revealed it from the beginning, such a thing wouldn't have happened. Klopp seemed extremely angry, but he couldn't do anything with a pregnant Omega by his side. Aylock smiled and held Klopp's hand, placing it on his belly. The woman's visits became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Even after such an insult of being sent away, she didn't cut ties with Klopp immediately. She must have had quite an affection for Klopp. Indeed, although he had a child, an unmarried aristocrat with wealth and abilities like Klopp was popular everywhere. Aylock was once the object of such admiration, but now he had become Klopp's Omega. He had already conceived their second child, and no matter what happened in the past, it was only right for him to reflect on himself to some extent. Although Klopp was extremely angry, Aylock acted oblivious. It was Klopp who didn't mention anything about the woman. He looked heartbroken. During his pregnancy, Aylock would occasionally get a mild heat and he boldly asked Klopp to have sex with him. Klopp strongly hated it, but he couldn't help but give in to the pregnant Omega's urgings. Sometimes, Aylock would play sick and get the doctor to nag Klopp, telling him to be gentle with the pregnant Omega. In the end, Klopp lost again. With a stern look, he removed Aylock's thin nightgown. Aylock smiled as Klopp slowly entered his body. Soon, a large penis was inside his body. As he only had a small amount of slick, it became extremely painful with each thrust. Aylock whimpered softly, more from agony than pleasure, sweating profusely. Klopp held Aylock's arms and focused on forcing his legs apart, thrusting into him. It didn't take long before something hot was released and filled inside Aylock. The pain was worse than when he was in heat, so Aylock couldn't even have a full erection, but he was still satisfied. Klopp pulled out of Aylock's body, cursing under his breath. "Are you satisfied?" Moreover, Klopp didn't even remove his clothes, so he could easily leave this spot. Alok hurriedly grabbed his hand. Don't go. What else do you want now? The irritation in his voice extinguished the passion he just had in his chest. But Alok didn't back down, and his tone was calm. Sleep next to me. Klopp glared at him as if he would kill him and trembled with anger, but in the end, he couldn't refuse again. Still naked, Alok nestled into the Alpha's arms and closed his eyes. Who would have thought that pregnancy could be used for this? Giving birth was painful and tough for his body, but if Klopp stayed by his side like this, Alok thought he could endure giving birth a few more times. He hoped the second child would be Alpha. An Omega who gave birth to an Alpha would secure a reputation to their name. Even if it would be a little difficult for him, after giving birth to one more child in the future, Klopp would give up and accept the reality. His partner was not the deceased Raphael, but Alok. It was at the bottom where the ugly, twisted petals had arrogantly held on and fallen to the fierce rain. Trampled countless times by uncaring steps, the petals could no longer maintain their color and blended with the dirt, losing their shape. The place, where the arrogance of beauty should have lasted forever, would be washed away and filled with the scars of rotting petals. As the pain washed over him, Alok stood in front of the rose garden once again. Wearing tattered clothes, Alok's skinny body was leaning back at the deserted cabin. When he absent-mindedly looked towards the distance, he saw Klopp. And he also saw 6 angelic children. Alok watched that scene mesmerized. It was the first time he saw all 6 children. Overwhelmed by his emotions, he tried to run towards them, but for some reason, his legs wouldn't move. So he called out to Klopp. He tried so many times, with all his might, yet no sound came out. He was definitely screaming, but he couldn't hear anything in his ears. Even when he waved his hands and yelled, Klopp didn't look back at Alok. Instead, he looked happily at Raphael, who was standing beside him. So he was alive. A beautiful person approached the children with a bright smile. The children circled around him, calling out, "Mom! Mom!" Those children. They were Raphael's children. I don't have any children. It's strange. Why did I try to run towards them? Alok stood there in devastation, and then his legs gave out, causing him to take a step back. Strangely, the legs that couldn't run suddenly moved. Soon after, he heard a dull sound. Looking down, he saw blood flowing profusely between his legs. Ah, that's right. I was on the verge of dying. He lifted his head and looked at Klopp and the children again. And also at Raphael, who was smiling like an angel. Klopp seemed happy. He smiled brightly, like in his faint memory. But strangely, he didn't feel any jealousy. Only that his heart ached, and something leaked from his eyes. He reached out his hand and found clear moisture. Tears. Right. Now I know how to cry. Alok smiled as tears dripped down his cheeks and chin into his palms. Then he raised his head again, and Klopp was looking at him. While crying and smiling, Alok realized. Now there was no need for words. He was just smiling, but Klopp looked at Alok for a short moment, then he turned away and went back to where his wife and children were calling him. Far away. Until he was beyond reach. In the cabin, the dim darkness crept up from under his feet. He was no longer afraid of the calm darkness, which felt neither cold nor hot. Alok watched Klopp's back as he disappeared into the distance and said. If it's not love, then I don't know what to call this. If there's a next time, that time, I want to love you. The complete darkness rose, engulfing his ankles, knees, thighs, stomach, chest, and finally his neck. The layers wrapped around him like soft flower petals. Through the final closing cracks of darkness, iridescent fragments scattered away. Into the Rose Garden, Part 1 Fin. To be continued in the next volume. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 1 Chapter Next Volume Preview. Volume 2 Preview. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The years passed uneventfully. The man always sat in that same place, gazing at the cabin. On a dark night with a raging snowstorm, the man, who was staring out without any movement, stood up and rushed outside. He grabbed his coat and ran outside, not bothering to put it on. Despite nearly stumbling multiple times in the heavy snow, his gaze remained fixated on the desolate place hidden by darkness and the snowstorm. The once dark brown hair was now covered with snow, making it impossible to discern its color. The man didn't even consider the fact that his expensive clothes and shoes were getting wet. He hastily reached the cabin, only to find dust and loneliness inside. He clearly saw a light. It was a faint but persistent light, never extinguishing even amidst the blizzard and darkness, just like his shine. However, the cabin remained engulfed in pitch-black darkness. Unable to believe it, he called out the name he had repeated countless times in his mind again and again. However, even after shouting with all his might, nothing could push away the suffocating silence except for the deafening roar of the snowstorm. Stepping out with heavy steps, the man buried himself in the snow and gazed at the cold stone visible only at the end of his sight. Ah! Belatedly realizing it, he brushed his cold, damp hair with his brash hands. He continued to stare at the tombstone until he lost all his senses up to the tips of his fingers, submerged in snow up to mid-calf. That was the man's first delirium. When he opened his eyes, he felt tears streaming down his cheeks. It felt like he had a tremendously agonizing dream. He dreamt of an unimaginably hellish place where he couldn't even struggle and gradually succumb to insanity, a miserable and agonizing dream that made no sense. Damn! What the hell is this? Suddenly, with his hands still tingling, he roughly wiped his tear-streaked face and stood up. His eyes caught sight of an unfamiliar luxurious interior. He was in the Count Estate's guest room. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he wiped his moist face again. Maybe it was because he had slept in an unfamiliar place. He was usually not particularly sensitive, but his mood felt strange. Though no one else was in the room, the fact that an adult alpha had cried over a mere nightmare made him feel embarrassed, so he quickly straightened the sheets and got out of bed. Taking a few deep breaths, he brushed his hair that fluttered in the early morning breeze and looked into the distance. From the second floor, he could see a rose garden not too far away. The sun had yet to rise, so it still looked dark, but when he first entered this room, he couldn't help but be awestruck by how glamorous it was. It felt like he could already smell the roses all the way up here. He wasn't particularly interested in flowers, but he was slightly looking forward to this rose garden. This place would give him a new opportunity. Just as he gazed at it once again, he saw a shabby building far away through the rows of trees. Is it a barn? Or a gardener's cabin? Whatever it was, it didn't suit the extravagant rose garden at all. A count this wealthy would have had many employers, and it was natural to have accommodations and workplaces for them throughout the garden. But they weren't built in plain sight like that thing. Concealing for aesthetics is typical, but that was none of Klopp's business. This mansion belonged to Count Alok T. Wind, so it was his problem to solve. Perhaps it was deliberately done like that due to the Count's rumored peculiar taste. The massive trees reminded him of the dense forests in his hometown in the north. He hadn't seen much trees since he came to study here. He took a deep breath, shaking off all the remaining irritation. Since there wasn't really anything to smile about, he continued to walk with a serious expression, and someone appeared in the distance. The person, slightly shorter than himself with delicate features, seemed to be an alpha male, but there was a strangely erotic aura about him. With a sophisticated and elegant gait that suited his refined appearance, he looked to this side and was extremely surprised to discover him. He abruptly came to a stop. Even from a considerable distance, Klopp could sense his blue eyes trembling. What's this? There's no one else around. He couldn't understand why the person looked so shocked, as if he had seen a ghost upon seeing him. At that moment, a breeze brushed against his hair, poking his eyes, and he brushed his hair away, annoyed. When he faced the person again, their expression had changed. Gone was the surprise of a moment ago, replaced by the thin smile of an aristocrat, making him look clearly of the upper class, born and raised in the city. Gracefully and lightly, as if carried by the wind, he started to guide the way without even being asked, saying, "The rose garden is that way." Although it was somewhat arrogant and rude, it was so fitting that there was no room for him to complain. It was usual to not have any conversation in unfamiliar encounters, but in their walk together, he felt a strange sensation. Clearly, this was the first time he saw this person. Even when he quickly looked back on his relatively short life, there was no occasion where he had become involved with such an elegant city aristocrat. But why did he feel a sense of familiarity? "I am Klopp Bandyke." Extending his hand for a handshake, the other person finally looked straight at Klopp. After making a slightly awkward and blank expression, he soon regained his smooth smile. Then, with a face as fair as his hand, he reached out and shook Klopp's hand. "Alok T. Wind." Somehow he had a feeling he would be him. It wasn't that he knew he was a count, but he did expect him to have a title of that reputation. "Thank you for guiding me the way." He worked in the office until late. Recently, there was urgent paperwork that needed to be done due to an increase in new clients. He also had a backlog of investment proposals to review. He was planning to finish just a few more things and go home, but he got a visitor this late at night. Who is it at this late hour? He was not dressed appropriately to meet a client, but it wasn't particularly courteous for the visitor to visit the office at this late hour either. In fact, that person should be relieved that they didn't get yelled at and shooed right away. His secretary had already left, so Klopp had to personally open the office door, which had a nameplate with "Bandyke" on it. It wouldn't take him long to open the door, but before it was even halfway open, the visitor banged on it with a force like they were about to break it down. "Are you out of your mind at this hour? So you're here after all." Standing in the dark corridor and dressed in a dark suit, the visitor surprisingly turned out to be the blonde young count. Startled by his unexpected appearance, Klopp leaned on the door frame with his arms and stared at him blankly. With a slightly stiff and awkward smile, the count asked, "Can you spare me a moment? What brings you here?" Alok revealed the purpose of his visit without hesitation. "I made an investment recently and incurred losses. It wasn't a significant loss, but because everyone kept telling me to meet you, I reluctantly came here. To think that you could lose enough money to buy 10 ordinary houses in the Eastern Gem Mine and still call it not a significant loss. Truly, T-Wind is remarkable. Did you already know?" The count's smile became a little awkward. Leaning his upper body back and resting it against the backrest, Klopp spoke. "News spreads quickly in this industry. Then our talk would be fast too. Regarding the investment agent. I'm not taking any more clients. I'm already overwhelmed with my current clients, and I don't want to deal with annoying clients who easily fall for shoddy investment schemes that are nothing more than scams." Klopp rested his chin on his hand while leaning his elbow on the armrest and smirked. Alok's pride seemed to be wounded by that and he tightly pursed his lips. He then pulled out a neatly folded letter from inside his well-tailored jacket, which accentuated his physique. "What's this?" "A recommendation letter." Klopp received it and opened it. The content wasn't long. "It's me. No need for small talk, make a contract with him. This is all for your good. Derbyshire. That damned old man." Klopp gritted his teeth. As he exerted a little force with his fingertips, the high-quality handmade paper got creased. Seeing him, Alok grimaced a little, as if in disapproval, but then smiled again. "I have no intention to make a contract with a barbarian like you. However, it would be impolite to reject a recommendation from Viscount Derbyshire, Benove Com. Did you have a heartbreak?" The words that came out of nowhere sounded sarcastic even to his own ears. While Klopp was inwardly flustered, Alok lowered the hand that was rubbing his eyes and raised the corner of his mouth, smiling. Turning his head slightly, he glanced in this direction with trembling lips. I can get hurt too. Klopp couldn't make sense of that absurd response. What's with him? Did he really have a heartbreak, or is there something else going on with him? Klopp remained silent and stared into his wet blue eyes. He couldn't look away from him. The shock was too much. No matter how much Alok wiped away his tears, they continued to fall, soon smearing his face and dampening the back of his hand. For him to cry this much, he must have loved someone so deeply and had a falling out with them. He didn't expect the arrogant aristocrat could cry that pitifully. If you were heartbroken, it might be better for you to not wander around at night drenched with a scent that would make you pass as an omega. You might end up in a situation with more than a little embarrassment if an alpha passed by and mistook you as one. Alok, whose tears hadn't dried, smiled again and retorted, as long as it's not you. Although it wasn't a particularly malicious statement, Klopp felt as if sanity was slipping away. Even without that, he was constantly getting turned on, and now that he could even smell Alok's intoxicating scent, which was enough to make his head hurt, he almost lost control of his self-restraint. He clenched his fists tightly. His hand, pressed against the bandage, throbbed with pain, but it seemed to bring him back to his senses. Since it's not my concern, you can act however you want with your body, whether as an alpha or omega. But I hope you'll choose someone who doesn't spend money excessively. He finally managed to utter the words he had intended to say for a while now. It was becoming agonizing to keep looking at him. Why did Alok have to be an alpha? Klopp bit down on it and glared at Alok. His tears that had dried started to fall again. What's this? Did you really have a heartbreak? Klopp said sarcastically with a furrowed brow, and Alok wiped away his tears with his already damp hand. Then, without retorting, he turned away from Klopp, intending to leave. That response seemed to come from his sarcasm, as Alok deliberately nudged his shoulder while passing by. The remaining shred of Klopp's shallow self-restraint was completely shattered. Klopp reached out and grabbed the wrist of the figure that had moved a few steps away. Hey! To be continued in the next volume. And this is really the end of Volume 1. I'll start posting Volume 2 next week. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 2 Chapter 1.1. All again you are listening at novelfull.audio. Part 2. Into the brilliant garden. Once he realized it, the dull tombstone had become surrounded by blooming and colorful flowers. The man would visit the grave from time to time, always wanting to say something, but in the end, he would leave without uttering a word. This wasn't the ending that he had wanted. He wanted to hold on to the person who was becoming as light as a piece of paper and keep him by his side forever. Even if his end was inevitable, he wished to postpone it for as long as he could. But by the time he realized this, it was already too late. That pregnancy was supposed to be his last, but the person who couldn't bear it any longer without the white pills had already shattered off what little life he had left. Then, he had given those parts to his 2 children and left. If he hadn't had children, would he have lived longer? That probably wouldn't happen. The 2 children, born after Alok became addicted to drugs, were fragile and late in development. They cried incessantly and constantly sought attention. When he tried to soothe and hold them, they would hit and push him away. However, they would still cling to him with their small hands. As he held them, sobbing beyond belief, he knew he couldn't shorten their lives. It would take a long time for these children to stand on their own. Because of the children, there was never a moment when he felt miserable or lonely. However, after each child grew older, they found their beloved person and left. The laughter and cries that once filled the grand estate disappeared. The man sat in his chair, his body aged and settled, only gazing out at the window. Beyond the glass of the large balcony that reached from the floor to the ceiling, he saw a glamorous rose garden, like colorful jewels sprinkling on the green lawn. And the cabin that was hidden between the walls of cypress trees. Along with his own sins. The years passed uneventfully. The man always sat in that same place, gazing at the cabin. On a dark night with a raging snowstorm, the man, who was staring out without any movement, stood up and rushed outside. He grabbed his coat and ran outside, not bothering to put it on. Despite nearly stumbling multiple times in the heavy snow, his gaze remained fixated on the desolate place hidden by darkness and the snowstorm. The once dark brown hair was now covered with snow, making it impossible to discern its color. The man didn't even consider the fact that his expensive clothes and shoes were getting wet. He hastily reached the cabin, only to find dust and loneliness inside. He clearly saw a light. It was a faint but persistent light, never extinguishing even amidst the blizzard and darkness, just like his shine. However, the cabin remained engulfed in pitch-black darkness. Unable to believe it, he called out the name he had repeated countless times in his mind again and again. However, even after shouting with all his might, nothing could push away the suffocating silence except for the deafening roar of the snowstorm. Stepping out with heavy steps, the man buried himself in the snow and gazed at the cold stone visible only at the end of his sight. Ah! Realizing it belatedly, he brushed his cold, damp hair with his brash hands. He continued to stare at the tombstone until he lost all his senses up to the tips of his fingers, submerged in snow up to mid-calf. That was the man's first delirium. When he opened his eyes, he felt tears streaming down his cheeks. It felt like he had a tremendously agonizing dream. He dreamt of an unimaginably hellish place where he couldn't even struggle and gradually succumbed to insanity, a miserable and agonizing dream that made no sense. Damn! What the hell is this? Suddenly, with his hands still tingling, he roughly wiped his tear-streaked face and stood up. His eyes caught sight of an unfamiliar luxurious interior. He was in the Count Estate's guest room. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he wiped his moist face again. Maybe it was because he had slept in an unfamiliar place. He was usually not particularly sensitive, but his mood felt strange. Though no one else was in the room, the fact that an adult alpha had cried over a mere nightmare made him feel embarrassed, so he quickly straightened the sheets and got out of bed. Taking a few deep breaths, he brushed his hair that fluttered in the early morning breeze and looked into the distance. From the second floor, he could see a rose garden not too far away. The sun had yet to rise, so it still looked dark, but when he first entered this room, he couldn't help but be awestruck by how glamorous it was. It felt like he could already smell the roses all the way up here. He wasn't particularly interested in flowers, but he was slightly looking forward to this rose garden. This place would give him a new opportunity. Just as he gazed at it once again, he saw a shabby building far away through the rows of trees. Is it a barn? Or a gardener's cabin? Whatever it was, it didn't suit the extravagant rose garden at all. A count this wealthy would have had many employers, and it was natural to have accommodations and workplaces for them throughout the garden. But they weren't built in plain sight like that thing. Concealing for aesthetics is typical, but that was none of Klopp's business. This mansion belonged to Count Alok T. Wind, so it was his problem to solve. Perhaps it was deliberately done like that due to the Count's rumored peculiar taste. A moment later, he could hear the sounds of servants waking up the dawn and bustling in the corridor outside the door. Klopp left the view of the rose garden and the particularly desolate-looking cabin behind and entered the room. Count Twind was a high-ranking aristocrat, famous for his long-standing tradition and immense wealth comparable to the royal family. Now that the world had changed, with the rise of the emerging affluent class and the slowly collapsing class system, even the advocates of egalitarianism, who shouted that there was no such thing as born-aristocrat people, kept their mouths shut in front of them. The Twind family was not simply a snobbish noble family, they were true lords, in the sense of fulfilling their noble duties. Even now, when they had no direct obligations, they took the initiative in aiding the poor within their territory. They wanted to give opportunities to many young people who could reach higher That was precisely the reason why Klopp had come there. The Count invited promising young individuals who were talented but lacked inherited titles or wealth, connecting them with sponsors. The sponsorship group, known as the Tea Party in the Rose Garden, was packed with aristocrats who enjoyed the noble hobby of nurturing talents and ambitious young people, who were determined to succeed through these aristocrats' hobbies. At the same time, it was also full of frightening parents, who came with the intention of disposing of their burdensome Omega offspring. They pick out young alphas with their sharp gazes as if they were picking out horses in a stallion market. Klopp, who majored in law and economics at the National Capital University and graduated with excellent grades, was of course invited. He was the second son of Baron Van Dyck, but since his elder brother was an alpha, he wasn't in line to inherit the family. Moreover, the family itself was located in a remote countryside that very few know of, and they were poor, so there was nothing remarkable about them. The only thing his family could offer him was tuition fees. However, even with that, it was difficult to cover the expenses of studying abroad. Fortunately, Klopp was an exceptionally brilliant student. He was able to receive a state scholarship through a professor's recommendation and also enjoyed a free dormitory in return for assisting the professor. Although his school life wasn't impoverished, he had no intention of continuing a difficult life. He aspired to become an economic lawyer or an expert in global investments, but at the moment, he had no reputation or connections, and he also had no immediate profits. That's why today was very important for his future. After washing himself with the water brought by the maid and putting on a new suit he had bought with his small savings, Klopp wore the cufflinks that his father had passed down to him. He had barely seen his father throughout his study abroad, but he was able to attend his graduation ceremony. They were plain and somewhat old-fashioned, but the aged shine added a little more sense of sophistication to the young man. Standing in front of the mirror, he adjusted his tie and brushed back a few stray strands of his hair. This should look fine. He had never thought of himself as handsome, but he didn't think he lacked charm either. After all, he had never lacked Omega lovers since his university days, but he wasn't currently dating anyone. And he hadn't specifically come here to find himself an Omega. Some prideless aristocrats wanted to sell themselves as stallions to noble families that only had Omegas, but Klopp wasn't such a lowly person. At the very least, he wanted to maintain his dignity as an individual and carve out his own life. Today, what he sought was not a decadent and low-minded relationship based on body and pheromones, but companionship with an individual who would recognize his expertise. And he was quite confident in it. This is the start of Volume 2. Update will be every 3.4 days. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 2 Chapter 1.2. All again you are listening at novelfull.audio. The Grand Rose Garden transformed into a sponsorship party that lasted for about 3 days. It was more like a grand banquet than a tea party. Since only tea and snacks were served without alcohol, it was just called a tea party in the name. The glamorous flower garden, which was said to have been built by a king who was so in love with his queen that he sold his country to build them, was adorned with young people in full dress even before the tea party officially began. Like mating peacocks, they fluttered their wings and showed off their elegance. Although he had arrived a little early, Klopp couldn't help but be surprised by the number of people who had already gathered there. First, he was taken aback by the arrogance of the alphas who strutted around without any sense of shame. Second, he was astonished by the pheromones that the Omegas emitted, who were far from shying away from those alphas, but instead casting flirtatious glances and smiling at them. Third, as soon as he stepped into the space that could be called the center of the Rose Garden, he was met with hostile gazes from the alphas and intense, curious looks from the Omegas. A shiver ran down his spine. He had been told that this was a social gathering, but this felt more like a marketplace for blind meetings. Damn it! He didn't even have a chance to look around to see where the distinguished gentlemen and their wives, who could engage in discussions about investments and law, were located. Before he was even offered a cup of tea, a group of Omegas, led by a dignified middle-aged Omega, who had "Mother Representative" or "Matchmaker" written on her face, charged towards him. He had no choice but to turn and run away. Otherwise, he feared he would be stripped naked on the spot and forced into mating with those many Omegas. First and foremost, he needed to look ahead and get as far away as possible. He could hear the cries of Omegas searching for him, like hounds chasing a fox. They were relentless and persistent too. He skillfully maneuvered through the tall, towering trees. It wasn't until he was a good distance away and the sound of pursuit had completely died down that Clop wiped the sweat on his forehead. This was a complete mistake. The professor had said there would be plenty of opportunities, but he had mistaken it for diversity in conversational topics. He felt like a fool for dressing up and preparing himself. His expectations had already hit rock bottom, so he didn't want to go back to the Rose Garden. It would be better to return to his room and catch up on the sleep he hadn't gotten because of his restless dream. And he would have to leave this place immediately tomorrow and explore other options. Clop clenched his teeth and headed towards the nearby estate that came into view. He was sure that the estate was nearby. However, why was the garden so complicated that the closer he got, the farther he seemed to be? On top of his surly mood, his irritation began to creep in. If the cool breeze hadn't blown in and cooled his temper, he would have snapped and broken every damn tree in that spot. It was only detrimental to himself to let his temper flare up when he couldn't find his way. If only there was someone passing by, he could have asked for directions. But all people must be busy in the Rose Garden that wasn't too far from here. There wasn't a single ant in sight, let alone a human. At this point, it seemed better to take a stroll along the path lined with pine trees in the other direction and reflect on his current situation. As he walked alongside the towering trees that soared into the sky, his irritation slowly began to dissipate. Perhaps he had grown tired of this complicated city. The massive trees reminded him of the dense forests in his hometown in the north. He hadn't seen much trees since he came to study here. He took a deep breath, shaking off all the remaining irritation. Since there wasn't really anything to smile about, he continued to walk with a serious expression, and someone appeared in the distance. The person, slightly shorter than himself with delicate features, seemed to be an alpha male, but there was a strangely erotic aura about him. With a sophisticated and elegant gait that suited his refined appearance, he looked to this side and was extremely surprised to discover him. He abruptly came to a stop. Even from a considerable distance, Clop could sense his blue eyes trembling. What's this? There's no one else around. He couldn't understand why the person looked so shocked, as if he had seen a ghost upon seeing him. At that moment, a breeze brushed against his hair, poking his eyes, and he brushed his hair away, annoyed. When he faced the person again, their expression had changed. Gone was the surprise of a moment ago, replaced by the thin smile of an aristocrat, making him look clearly of the upper class, born and raised in the city. Gracefully and lightly, as if carried by the wind, he started to guide the way without even being asked, saying, "The Rose Garden is that way." Although it was somewhat arrogant and rude, it was so fitting that there was no room for him to complain. It was usual to not have any conversation in unfamiliar encounters, but in their walk together, he felt a strange sensation. Clearly, this was the first time he saw this person. Even when he quickly looked back on his relatively short life, there was no occasion where he had become involved with such an elegant city aristocrat. But why did he feel a sense of familiarity? "I am Clop Bandyke." Extending his hand for a handshake, the other person finally looked straight at Clop. After making a slightly awkward and blank expression, he soon regained his smooth smile. Then, with a face as fair as his hand, he reached out and shook Clop's hand. Alok T. Wind. Somehow he had a feeling he would be him. It wasn't that he knew he was a count, but he did expect him to have a title of that reputation. "Thank you for guiding me the way." First of all, as Clop was the guest here, he expressed his gratitude. The Count, whom he thought would respond coldly to match his arrogance just now, surprisingly smiled genuinely. Suddenly, the pit of his stomach tightened. Seeing his bright and sincere smile brought him an uncomfortable feeling. At the same time, the strange sensation he had right after his nightmare earlier enveloped his body again. Klopp frowned and stared intently at the Count looking at him. Suddenly, he felt his anger rise at that smile and had the urge to strangle him. What's going on? Why am I feeling like this? Is it jealousy? No, it doesn't seem like it. He felt like he was about to explode with a kind of dissatisfaction and irritation. He wanted to do something to the man standing in front of him, but he couldn't figure out exactly what or how. It was an inexplicable desire that he couldn't put into words. The handshake became prolonged, and before an awkward silence could set in, the two of them released their hands with a small cough. Klopp took deliberate deep breaths and steadied his resolve. There was no running away from the stare of the Count who had led him the way. Why did they come to the rose garden in the first place? He should have asked to be guided to the estate. Regret always came too late. Nevertheless, he felt slightly better than before. He had some time to prepare himself mentally. After brushing his hair back with his hand, Klopp took a step forward and entered the rose garden. He sensed someone following him from behind. Glancing back, he found Alok, who he thought would guide him in, but instead, he was walking behind him. As the two entered, the gathered crowd all turned their attention to them. Specifically, they were probably looking at Alok Tewand, the Count. Just like a pack of starving wolves running on the meadow, they flocked towards Alok Tewand, their tempting prey. After a while, Klopp found himself standing alone in a far corner of the rose garden. As if they were starving for something to eat, people were trying to talk to Alok, ignoring others. It didn't seem like high status and wealth were the only things he possessed. Among the swarm of ants rushing towards the sweet jam, there were already some half-lidded omegas who were enchanted. Objectively speaking, Alok was an attractive charming single alpha, so it was not surprising. Occasionally, he could even see an alpha who looked at Alok with sticky gazes. Was he himself like that earlier? Klopp quickly averted his gaze, but that alpha didn't. He couldn't understand why he felt irritated seeing that alpha casually approaching Alok from behind. The butlers and maids appeared, offering the guests a taste of luxurious black tea. It was the first time Klopp tasted such tea. The tea was a feast for his sense of smell and taste buds. There were sweets to satisfy his eyes as well. Most of the city's upper classes drank their tea with cream. It was rare to drink it with just sugar. Unlike them, Klopp only needed a spoonful of sugar. He didn't have much of a sweet tooth, and back in his hometown, this was how he drank black tea. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 2 Chapter 1.3. All again you are listening at novelfull.audio. While Klopp was sipping 2 cups of black tea, Alok continued to engage in conversations with people, wearing a faint smile. The cup of tea in his hand had barely been touched and was cooling down. The people standing right in front of the young Count may not have noticed, but as Klopp continued to watch him in this direction, he could clearly sense it. Every now and then, he met his blue eyes. Each time that happened, Alok would give a charming smile. In contrast, Klopp's mood grew even more somber. He had been puzzled and unable to understand his feelings since earlier. At first, he wondered if he was jealous of the handsome aristocrat with his wealth and status. Until now, Klopp had never shown much interest in others. He never felt inferior because he believed in his own abilities, regardless of his lack of wealth or status. Just to test it out, he approached a relatively unremarkable-looking alpha who seemed wealthy and struck up a conversation. The person had shown an initial interest but quickly lost interest and threw a mocking smile at Klopp. However, Klopp didn't feel any jealousy nor inferiority. Instead, he found himself sneering at the person who had nothing to boast about except their own family. Of course, he didn't show it outwardly. But it was different with the Count. He was extremely displeased at the fact that Alok was smiling amongst those people. An Omega, who seemed like they could go into heat any moment, subtly stroked Alok's arm. The teacup in Klopp's hand trembled as he watched the alpha who had been flirting with Alok since earlier casually tap him on the shoulder. He gripped the handle tightly before the exquisitely patterned teacup could spill. Yet, he couldn't help but feel angry as he watched the Count didn't immediately brush off their hands, only skillfully avoiding with his body. This feeling was certainly not something one should have for someone who they met for the first time. Something felt off. His original plan to seize an opportunity here had disappeared somewhere. The whole time, Klopp wore a dissatisfied expression, full of unfulfilled frustration. It continued throughout the tea party. Restless, Klopp constantly followed Alok with his eyes, while the easygoing Count, whether aware of his feelings or not, smiled at him whenever their eyes met. Finally, tired of dealing with people, Alok gracefully parted the swarm of ants and sneaked his way toward Klopp. It seemed as if it happened unintentionally, but in the first place, there was no reason for him, who was the center of the social gathering, to come to this far corner. Only when Alok was fairly close did he suddenly exchange glances with Klopp, as if he hadn't known he was here, and greeted him again. Everyone is desperate. With a faint smile, the Count approached him, while mocking the people who he had just been polite with. Although he had exchanged pleasantries with Klopp, they weren't close enough to exchange such remarks. It was such an arrogant act from Alok. Already irritated, Klopp gave him a quick glance and then turned to the other side, responding coldly. "You must smell delicious to them." It was a grossly offensive remark, which even had Klopp surprised himself for saying that. Alok seemed greatly shocked to be called a lecherous guy who exudes a strong scent. Such a rude remark from a stranger would normally have made them flare up with anger. Of course, the Count himself had uttered words that he shouldn't say to a stranger, but Klopp's remarks were on a completely different level. Especially if they were a noble and respected aristocrat like Alok, who was the subject of people's adoration and flattery, the aristocrat would immediately kick the impudent speaker out of the estate. Or perhaps Alok might slap him with that seemingly gentle hand. Klopp even wished for a fight and to be driven away. He didn't think there was much to be gained in this place, but he couldn't find the will to leave on his own. However, Alok only slightly furrowed his brow and raised the corner of his mouth a little. He must not know how to get angry as he was too much of an aristocrat, Klopp thought. But that thought was shattered immediately. Handing the now cooled teacup to a passing butler, Alok spoke calmly but a little quickly. "BDNV, it's better than not being able to catch a single bug when you're chasing for food." His calm and measured voice trembled slightly, but that made it sound even more arrogant. This, too, was extremely insulting, no less than Klopp's blunt words. It was as if Alok was sneering at him. "You're such a pathetic little bastard, there's nothing worthy to look at." Alok even looked Klopp up and down. The Count had smiled at him earlier, but now he was visibly angry, glaring at Klopp. Klopp didn't back down. Although he had initiated it himself, he couldn't help feeling extremely uncomfortable being insulted. At the same time, he found it somewhat amusing that the Count, who usually wore a mask-like smile to others, was glaring at him with such vivid eyes. No, I should correct myself and say it was quite satisfying. The two began hurling insults at each other whenever they bumped into each other, whether in the garden or inside the estate. Of course, this only happened when they were alone. When other people were present in the vicinity, Klopp would keep his mouth shut, but he wouldn't transform into a noble aristocrat like Alok, donning a subtle smile. It bothered him terribly, and he wanted to rip that mask off somehow. The sight of Alok in the garden, laughing hysterically with all those bugs, made Klopp's stomach turn, so he decided to take a look at the Count Estate's library. When he asked whether it was fine for him to explore the library, the silver-haired butler was happy to show him around. As renowned as its reputation, the Count's study was filled with books of exquisite quality. Most of them were humanities and philosophy books, and each one was worth a fortune. There were several books that seemed tempting to pick up and read immediately, but knowing that he would be leaving soon and not wanting to leave any regrets, Klopp refrained. Instead, he enjoyed the artwork hanging in the study. Honestly, when it came to art, Klopp's knowledge was not deep. To be more precise, he was still inexperienced in the fields of expensive music, art, and the arts that required a substantial amount of money to acquire relevant knowledge. These were essential to interact with the upper class, and his lack in that area even caused concern to his professors. Yet, even in Klopp's unknowledgeable eyes, he could see that the paintings hanging in the study were of a high caliber. Among the towering bookshelves that reached the ceiling, numerous large and small paintings were displayed. Among them, there were quite a few famous works of famous masters that even untrained eyes would recognize. However, what caught Klopp's eye as he explored the room was a landscape painting depicting a rural scene in early summer. With its intense color harmony, using white and bright yellow to represent dazzling light, the painting evoked a sense of tranquility as if he was looking at the scenery of his hometown. Upon closer inspection, he noticed the artist's signature and the year written in the corner, and it seemed that it was painted less than a year ago. It obviously looked like the work of a rookie. It seemed somewhat lacking to be hung alongside other collections, but Klopp thought that it might be a part of the tea party in the Rose Garden. The quiet study's door was suddenly flung open. Alok, think about it. It's going to be amazing. When he turned around, he saw Alok and an alpha standing at the door, engaged in an argument. The slightly larger alpha, with grease running down his face, pushed his sticky gaze onto the Count. He even ran a thick hand surreptitiously down the other man's arm. It was obvious that the other alpha had explicit sexual intentions, but Klopp was surprised at the fact that it was so openly displayed rather than concealed. Is he insane? Despite having a somewhat fair and smooth face, there was no doubt that the Count was an alpha. But the other person continued to act obscenely and touch the Count with his dirty hands. The problem was Alok. He merely twisted his body slightly to evade, without showing much resistance, as if he was acting naive or enjoying it. If it had been Klopp, he would have easily snapped the other's wrist. He would be shouting profanities and kicking. However, Alok didn't do that. He even showed a subtle smile. Like he was enjoying it. Klopp could only express his feelings as severely disgusted. He couldn't understand why he had to witness such a repulsive sight of alphas engaging in something disgusting, not even a simple romantic relationship. But even if he tried not to, he couldn't help but see and hear everything with his own eyes and ears. I'm still not interested. If I ever change my mind, I'll be sure to let you know. Right now, there's a book I must find. If you'll excuse me. After politely rejecting the other person, Alok entered the study. The scowling alpha gave him a wry smile that indicated he had little interest in the study and then left. Alok closed the door, turned around, and with a rather displeased expression, then walked with a slightly forceful stride, before spotting Klopp. He seemed surprised and froze just like before. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 2 Chapter 1.4. All again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What are you doing here? Alok displayed his obvious embarrassment, but Klopp had no reason to be considerate to the other person. I stopped by the study to cool my head and was admiring the decorated paintings. But I was dumbfounded when I saw some crazy alphas engaging in such an embarrassing act in broad daylight. Even if you say that, you're still talking fine. Keep looking at the paintings. You won't have a chance to see them again once you leave. With a slightly flushed face, Alok said that and turned his body, heading toward the other bookshelf. Klopp thought what he said earlier was just an excuse, but Alok was genuinely searching for a book. He sneered at him, saying things about acting like an omega for no reason, but Alok didn't even flinch and shot back with a dignified tone. Then he picked up a difficult humanities book to read, called, and headed for the sofa. So, he was planning to read a book here. Klopp debated whether he should leave the space. Even as his mind wandered, his gaze was fixed on the painting. This is a painting by a rookie artist who debuted in their first exhibition. It corresponds to early summer in their 4-season series. I know. He actually knew nothing about rookies or anything of the sort, but he replied anyway. It was clearly a lie that one could immediately realize, but Alok, who had come closer, didn't show any signs of noticing. Instead, he continued talking while looking at the painting himself. I happened to visit the exhibition before, and while none of the other paintings caught my attention, I couldn't take my eyes off this one from the moment I saw it. The bold use of colors is like, it looks like it's bathed in light. Yes. This artist loved this scenery very much. That's also right. This is a depiction of the countryside where the artist's grandparents lived, which they loved the most. Have you ever met the artist before? I haven't. I just saw the painting and it reminded me of the artist. I thought you were rude and uncultured, but surprisingly, you have a good eye. I'm impressed. At the exaggerated remark, Klopp narrowed his eyes and glared at Alok. Alok openly stared back and laughed. Do you know that you were treated like an omega by that bastard just now? And yet you're laughing. You must have a taste for smelly pigs. I know, that's why I was smiling. If I get serious, he'll think I'm interested. You should be watching your mouth. I don't know where you got an invitation from, but do you even have the time to meddle in trivial matters? That's a concern that I can handle on my own. For you, Count, you can stick to acting like an omega. And that's also a concern that I can handle on my own, honors graduate. Those blue eyes staring straight at him were annoyingly insolent. But seeing him effortlessly deflect every remark without uttering a single curse, Klopp thought maybe Alok wasn't a dimwit. In the Count's grand library, as vast as the Rose Garden, there were only Klopp and Alok at the moment. That meant they wouldn't be disturbed by others. It also meant that they could openly engage in a verbal duel. I thought you were looking for a place to mate leisurely, but it's quite shocking to see you reading such a scholarly humanities book. It's a classic that's difficult to read without a considerable amount of patience. Mate. A refined individual must cultivate various knowledge. Aren't you the one who should be finding a suitable partner for mating as soon as possible? Preferably, someone with a lot of money. Once again, sparks flew between the two. They looked at each other, putting on artificial smiles simultaneously, then bowed and turned away. Klopp moved towards another painting, while Alok carried the book and headed to the sofa in the center of the study. Klopp found it difficult to concentrate on the painting, but Alok seemed unaffected as the sound of pages turning continued constantly. He was reading faster than Klopp expected. Is he really reading? Or is he just skimming at the text? Klopp occasionally glanced back, and whenever he did, Alok hurriedly lowered his head and flipped through the book again. After flipping through several pages, he went back a few pages. It seemed like he wanted to show off his knowledge for no reason. Klopp snickered and moved towards another painting. After the tea party ended and he returned to his rent house, Klopp was invited to many gatherings through the professor's introductions. Most of them were older alphas, but occasionally, there were young aristocrats as well. Surprisingly, they were just ordinary, educated people. At such times, Klopp found himself thinking of the incomprehensibly arrogant Alok and felt himself getting worked up. A few months passed, and another invitation from Count T. Wind arrived. Previously, he received it through the professor, but this time, a butler came directly to Klopp's house to politely deliver it. He wants me to know right away if I'm going to be attending. Yes, my count asked me to deliver this message. I cannot make any special arrangements for your sake, so if you don't decide in advance, you'll end up standing at the banquet. Damned guy. Tell him I'll go, I am going there. Yes, I understood. Then I shall take my leave. The well-dressed, stern-looking butler in a neat black suit, bowed politely to Klopp and left. Meanwhile, Klopp closed the front door with a bang and unfolded the fancy card in his hand once again. The formal dinner invitation was not printed but handwritten. Judging by the elegant signature and the identical ink and handwriting, it seemed like Alok had written it himself. It was a challenge letter announcing their second round. By seeing that fair face of his turning into a naked grimace this time, it felt like his anger would finally subside. Klopp furrowed his brow and raised the corner of his mouth. He placed the invitation in a prominent spot on a bookshelf filled with various documents and books. He expected it to be a fairly large party, but this was something else entirely. It was like a New Year's banquet at a royal palace. Not only were there dazzlingly dressed men and women Omegas adorned with jewelry, but also alphas who looked as if they could cut stone with their hands, wearing finely tailored black suits and shining shoes. The party consisted of well over 100 people. He was sure he wasn't late, but Klopp was guided to the farthest corner from the main seat. Of course, in this spot, he could just raise his head to watch and not miss the fun happening on the other side. Why did I come here? It's obvious that I'm just stepping into the game that he's playing. Sipping on fine wine, Klopp couldn't hide his wrinkled expression. He should have anticipated this, but his thoughts were short-sighted. This time, Alok, who sat at the far end of the table in the main seat, must have a change of strategy. He had a beautiful Omega woman sitting right next to him. Even from a distance, she exuded a sensual and highly alluring charm. Clad in a deep green dress that accentuated her full red lips, she turned toward the blonde alpha next to her, whispering something in a flirtatious manner and giving him a seductive smile. Alok, impeccably dressed from head to toe, with not a hair out of place on his even fairer face than that woman's, occasionally glanced in this direction and made an eye smile. It seemed like Alok was mocking him, but that didn't really matter. Unlike the woman in the green dress, Alok looked charming even without red lipstick. Alok then gave his partner a short kiss on the cheek. And when those confident blue eyes met Klopp's eyes, only then, Klopp realized what he wanted. Oh my goodness! What am I imagining right now? I'm getting insane. Klopp downed the remaining wine in one gulp. Immediately, a waiter nearby refilled his glass. The wine was of high quality and well-aged, it went down smoothly. As the dinner progressed and Klopp's slight buzz intensified, he began engaging in conversations with the people around him without any hesitation. As someone who once dreamed of being a lawyer, his eloquence wasn't bad, and the people around him quickly joined in the conversation, distancing themselves from the guests in the center and focusing on Klopp. From light-hearted jokes to witty banter, everyone was laughing and enjoying the conversation. Later, the guests in the center were getting curious about this side and they exchanged glances. However, even though he was leading the conversation, Klopp couldn't remember exactly what he had said. His mind was too busy fantasizing about the count with blue eyes that occasionally glanced in his direction. His fantasies were crude enough that he felt disgusted with himself. The continuous fantasies made him unable to remember the uninteresting conversation. When the long dinner was finally nearing its end, Alok, still lively, wrapped his arm around the waist of the Omega woman and affectionately escorted her somewhere, disappearing. He didn't care about leaving early, despite being the host of the dinner and needing to lead the conversation. After the dinner, the guests split into Alpha and Omega groups and went to the lounges. In the Alpha Lounge, everyone began openly expressing things they couldn't say in public. Lord T-Wind always has a few secretive aspects. He only provides the venue and food, but he doesn't engage much in socializing. Actually, recently, he's been showing his face more often. In the past, he invited us to tea parties but never showed up. From the way he cuts conversations off at an appropriate time, maybe that's just his personality. The counts from previous generations weren't particularly sociable too. It's probably because he's too high-class and doesn't want to associate with ordinary people. Perhaps, but it seems like the Omegas find that aspect charming. They're already clamoring to find out who was the beautiful woman that he brought today. It's not only the Omegas. Recently, even Alphas have set their sights on him. Even if casual dating is trending recently, will T-Wind actually go along with it? I don't know. It's possible he might easily go along with it. Doesn't his body seem to fit well with getting embraced? The conversation among alphas began with that and eventually led to gossip and rumors. Klopp, who had only listened without actively participating, became uncomfortable and decided to leave. Everywhere he went, there were people who think using their dicks more than their heads. It wasn't time to leave yet, but he didn't feel the need to stay any longer, so Klopp asked a passing servant to fetch his carriage. Will you be leaving already? Shall I convey your message to the master? It's fine. The Count seems busy at the moment, I don't want to interrupt his leisure time. Klopp curtly replied to the butler's greeting and boarded his carriage. In reality, the reason why he felt it was difficult to hear the gossip among alphas was not simply because he felt uncomfortable about discussions regarding sexual activities between alphas. It was quite the opposite. For some reason, when Alok appeared with the beautiful Omega by his side, engaging in behaviors heavily laden with sexual overtones while looking at Klopp, he felt as if Alok was tempting him, instead of making fun of him. At that moment, Klopp felt heat rushing to the center of his body. So, he deliberately distracted himself by focusing on alcohol and conversations in the other direction. Otherwise, he felt like he would immediately rush over and grab Alok by the collar, before dragging him away to any room, locking him in there, and giving in to his desires. He still felt he was crazy to fantasize about that. In the rattling carriage, Klopp leaned back and crossed his legs with a troubled expression. He sighed, holding his forehead with his hand. He had definitely lost his mind. In front of countless people, he indulged in such fantasies without any sense of shame. That's why it was difficult to hear the gossip in the lounge. Every time he listened, he could fantasize about it. He was clearly being abnormal. Alok was a person he had only recently met, there were no attractive qualities in his personality, and moreover, he was an alpha. Klopp had always been attracted to people who were more pure and Omega-like, so there was no reason for him to find Alok charming. Yet, he couldn't understand why Alok's disheveled appearance kept coming to his mind. Perhaps showing up with such a beautiful woman was an extension of how Alok had always been sarcastic to him, calling him the poor honors graduate who has to work hard because he's poor. It would be hard for Klopp to meet that kind of Omega. However, Alok's teasing this time was of little use. Throughout the evening, it wasn't Alok who made Klopp jealous, but that woman. Acknowledging it himself, Klopp rubbed his face with both hands. I'll have to do something about this. If there's no solution, let's at least avoid him. This can't be happening to me. When the next invitation arrived, Klopp quickly declined, tossing the invitation into the fireplace to burn. He considered it better not to get involved with him for the sake of his smooth future. He poured time and effort into expanding his network through professors and soon was introduced to another wealthy and influential aristocratic family and secured his employment. Upon receiving his first fee, Klopp quickly proved his excellent skills in investment and negotiation, and soon earned the trust of the family, earning him a large sum of money. Through connections with his first client, it didn't take long for him to successfully secure more contracts, and he began to prosper. His workload had increased a lot. Klopp moved out of his rented house and purchased a modest house in the suburbs and an office in the city. It wasn't long before he was able to hire a housekeeper to take care of his house. Devoting himself solely to his work, Klopp became a successful investor. He would sometimes get too busy with his work, and the housekeeper, Martha, would scold him to have proper meals. In the meantime, he was able to forget about the Count who had gotten on his nerves and annoyed him at every turn. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 2 Chapter 2.1 The Fate Flows. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Viscount Derbyshire was a prominent figure among the nobility. He was a charismatic alpha aristocrat in his early 60s with a dignified appearance. He had a reputation among the aristocracy, much like T. Wind, and was known for his meddling nature and a keen eye for investment. He inherited a substantial fortune from his ancestors and multiplied that wealth on his own in this generation. As Klopp's first employer, he was genuinely fond of the young investor whom he believed he had discovered. Knowing that Klopp was single, having a nosy nature, he tried to connect Klopp with a good omega by any means necessary. On several occasions, he invited Klopp to his house, under the guise of business proposals, and made him socialize with unfamiliar omegas over tea. "Viscount, please, I beg you. Please stop forcing me into sudden blind dates. It's bad for my reputation to decline them. Besides, I'm not yet ready to settle down. My job is still my primary concern. You have to find someone first to settle down. Once the right person appears, you'll settle down quickly. Why else do you think we work? To establish a family. Trust me. You'll thank me later and express your gratitude." No matter how one looked at it, Viscount Derbyshire was relentless. Watching him laugh heartily, Klopp sighed in secret. Then, the Viscount happened to attend a distant relative's wedding. Aristocrat weddings were like a grand matchmaking market. As soon as Klopp heard the news, he quickly tried to schedule appointments with other clients to act busy. But somehow, Derbyshire knew about this and kidnapped Klopp. The Viscount took him in a carriage to the wedding of an aristocrat whose face and name he didn't even know. Even if you don't have any backing up, you're an excellent scion of an aristocratic family, so your spouse should also be an aristocrat. You have outstanding talents and appearance. There's no doubt you'd fit perfectly into a household without an alpha child among the respectable families. I guarantee it. You'll definitely inherit a title too. Even if Klopp said he wasn't interested in titles, Derbyshire confidently said, "Why aren't you interested in a title? It's not good to be too modest, Sir Klopp of Bandyke." It was as if he would sell Klopp immediately, bustling among the guests. When Viscount Derbyshire introduced the dashing bachelor Alpha, who had lost some of his countryside nature, there was a flurry of interested omegas. "Hello, Sir Bandyke. Call me Klopp." Klopp had already gotten exhausted from the very first omega he was introduced to, but he politely smiled and greeted the omegas. As it was more important for him to meet and impress their influential parents than to get the omega themselves, Klopp had to keep his mouth shut and do his best. Viscount Derbyshire, interpreting this as not being uninterested, dragged Klopp around and introduced him to countless omegas. Along the way, he made some good business contacts, including one who was interested in his abilities as an investor. The day's sacrifices were well worth it. Before that day ended, Klopp was introduced to the omega son of someone far like the friend of a relative to Viscount Derbyshire. Envied that he was called Raphael of Westport, and he bore a striking resemblance to someone Klopp knew. He had the same blonde hair, blue eyes, and very similar features as the ill-tempered and arrogant Count, but Raphael's personality was completely different. He was polite and careful in his choice of words. There was no arrogance in his eyes, just innocence and warmth. Klopp instantly liked him. Raphael didn't give off the impression of disliking Klopp either. If they were quite similar, a kind and innocent omega was much better than an ill-tempered alpha. Moreover, despite being a male, like an omega, Raphael's petite frame was very endearing, combined with his neat, simple, but sincere attire. Yes, if I were to date blonde hair and blue-eyed omega, this kind of omega would be much better for my emotional stability and a healthy future. Unlike the other omegas he had coldly treated, Viscount Derbyshire somehow sensed that Klopp had shown some interest in Raphael, so he discreetly led people away to another area. Suddenly, they were left alone, and Klopp felt awkward. "I knew you were rooting for me, but this is too much, old man. The Viscount is always ahead of us. He's an impatient person. I apologize." Raphael simply gave a small laugh. It was a genuine, unaffected smile, unlike the condescending Count's. "I heard that the Viscount is very fond of Sir Bandyke. Call me Klopp. Then, please call me Raphael." Taking advantage of the time they had alone, they strolled through the beautifully decorated wedding ceremony garden and started their conversation topic with the weather, then to other topics. Even without much conversation, Klopp could tell that Raphael was a nice Omega. He had manners and, above all, lacked the typical arrogance of the aristocrats. Raphael laughed genuinely, without any pretense, and seeing that, Klopp felt his heart melting. "Sir Klopp, you don't feel unfamiliar to me. I feel strangely close to you. I feel the same way. It's as if we've known each other for a long time. Is that so? Could it be that we've met each other in our previous life?" Klopp smiled in response to Raphael's sweet and pretty smile. But inwardly, he felt bad. He knew that the familiarity he felt was not some romantic past-life connection, but it was more akin to the arrogant count he'd met in the rose garden. What Klopp and Raphael felt wasn't exactly a strong love, but there was definitely a mutual attraction between them. Klopp pursued his relationship with Raphael in earnest. It was a bit early, but for Alpha and Omega of marriageable age to be in a relationship for that long was a sure sign of marriage. The people around them were pleased, saying that the two matched each other well. Viscount Derbyshire, in particular, was going crazy as if they were about to get married right away. However, Klopp didn't spread the news of their relationship with his own mouth. He felt burdened by the excessive attention. Even in the Westport family, who didn't know Klopp was well yet, he wanted to keep their private lives quiet until they officially announced their engagement. Nevertheless, their relationship grew steadily closer, and they began holding hands, sharing light embraces and kisses. When he was in university, Klopp had engaged in intimate encounters with many Omegas at the drop of a hat, like unleashed ponies, hoping to enjoy the limited time away from parental scrutiny. But he didn't want to do that with Raphael. It wasn't because he didn't have any sexual desires, but rather because their relationship was genuine and serious, so he was more cautious. Raphael also shared the same serious attitude. Considering Klopp's circumstances, where he couldn't afford to hire many servants, Raphael practiced taking care of household chores himself. From Klopp's perspective, he didn't think Raphael needed to do household chores, but as an Omega raised in an aristocratic family, Raphael seemed to consider household management as his duty. He even insisted that he was not bad at it. Sometimes, Klopp would laugh when he saw Raphael coming out with a bandage on his finger. "Don't laugh. Dealing with such a big fish is so difficult. Do you really need to practice cooking fish? In the Van Dyke family, they cook salmon during special holidays, so I should learn it too." Raphael averted his gaze and covered the bandaged finger with his other hand. His round ears were irresistibly cute when they turned red. On one hand, he felt so sorry for him that he'd injured his finger like that when all he'd ever had to do in his life was probably just washing a handkerchief. Klopp resolved to quickly earn money and establish a prosperous household, dreaming of a larger house and hiring a cook. He decided that once he achieved that, he would propose to Raphael. As Klopp worked hard and imagined a harmonious family, Raphael was always present in it. He felt that if he married Raphael, they could live happily together for a lifetime. It might be somewhat dull and tranquil, but that was exactly what the peaceful home that Klopp desired. The last thing he wanted was for there to be cold eyes and accusations between family members. Although he had never witnessed or experienced such things, ever since he started dreaming of a family, he'd been worried that something would happen to his family. He worried that he might make a mistake or that a sudden misfortune might strike them. Captured by such strange fears, there were times when he would wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares he couldn't remember. It was probably because he was overwhelmed by something that he hadn't fully settled in yet. This uncharacteristic anxiety in himself must have come from him growing up in a boring, quiet family in the countryside. To get himself settled, he threw himself into work, sacrificing sleep and taking advantage of the aristocrat's assets to make a profit. The more he worked, the more his skills became renowned, and more aristocrats sought him out. With that, his wealth steadily increased, and if this continued to pass smoothly without major issues, he felt that he could propose to Raphael by early next year. As he became busier with work, he had less time to spend on dating Raphael, but fortunately, Raphael understood him and didn't get upset. He understood why Klopp was so devoted to his work even without Klopp telling him. Even if they couldn't meet, Raphael still diligently prepared for their marriage. He would occasionally gift Klopp homemade snacks. "This is very delicious." "Really? I'll bring you more next time." "Thank you. I should give you a present as well." "It's okay. I baked a lot just for practice, so I'm sharing it with you." The practice was for Klopp and the future Bandits, so he couldn't pretend to be oblivious. However, at this point, Klopp knew giving small gifts to Raphael wouldn't hold much significance. His wealth had accumulated to some extent, and it was about time for them to get engaged. But he didn't want Raphael to get the slightest hint of his engagement plan. Without Raphael knowing, Klopp secretly went to a jeweler to purchase the engagement ring. Honestly, since way before, he had already looked through various different gemstones and designs, so he had ordered an elegant and sophisticated ring, making sure it wasn't too flashy. He received a message that the ring was completed and went to pick it up. If it weren't for the introduction from Viscount Derbyshire, he wouldn't have been able to enter the exclusive members-only jewelry store that aristocrats frequented, let alone buy it at a much affordable price. Platinum with sapphire. "Here is the ring." The polite attendant brought the ring to Klopp, who was sitting on a waiting sofa. The ring was more magnificent than he had imagined. He went to the manager's desk to sign a check to pay the remaining amount. As the manager searched through the ledger and looked for Klopp's name, Klopp overheard a conversation between the Omega aristocrats who were browsing the various jewels on display in glass cases. "Did you hear? Recently, Count T. Wind made a bad investment and suffered a huge loss. That's why he didn't attend the jewelry auction this time. Well, he's so wealthy that it shouldn't be a big blow to him. I heard he invested in a gem mine in the east. If that goes well, he'll recover several times the loss from this time." "Oh, really? Then, should we also invest in that?" When Klopp heard that conversation, his face turned sullen. There was only one gem mine in the east that he knew of, and it had already been completely depleted. Occasionally, a couple of gems were found there, but they were of low value. It was no longer worth investing a large sum of money into that gem mine. There were occasionally people who didn't know it was a depleted mine and invested due to its past reputation, but it was the first time Klopp heard that the aristocrats who were knowledgeable in investment information had touched that mine. While they would still get a cut loss, they should take their hands off it immediately. The conversation among the Omegas quickly moved on to another topic. Klopp thought about joining the conversation to know more about it, but the manager had just found the ledger and handed him the receipt for the remaining balance. Klopp wrote the exact amount in the checkbook and signed it, but the Omegas had already followed another staff member's guidance and went into the inner room. Putting the ring, which was wrapped in a small silk box, into his pocket, Klopp left the jewelry store. Count T. Wind is from a distinguished family, so he should be able to manage his investments on his own. He's not a nouveau riche who has only touched money for 10.20 years. He probably has steady investment options and has hired capable managers. Besides, it has nothing to do with me. Klopp quickly put aside his thoughts and touched the ring box in his pocket. He caught a passing carriage and headed towards the office. "Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment.